China has successfully launched its Shenzhou 15 spacecraft, heralding a new era in its growing space ambitions.
3、2、1，点火！
Shenzhou 15 lifted off in sub-freezing temperatures in the Gobi Desert in northwest China. 3 astronauts were on board, which has since docked. The trio are tasked with putting the final touches on the multi-module Tiangong station. They will also be part of the country's first crew rotation in orbit, living on the Tiangong for 6 months before being replaced by another group next year. All of this is the culmination of nearly 2 decades of Chinese crewed missions to space. Now, the Tiangong will be the second permanently inhabited outpost in orbit after NASA's International Space Station. It is seen as an emblem of China's growing clout and confidence in its space endeavors. Now, China has not been part of the ISS and was officially excluded in 2011 after the U.S. banned NASA from interacting with Beijing. With a sustained presence in Earth's orbit, Chinese space officials are now setting their sights further. They want to put astronauts on the moon within a decade. Here's a look at China's space ambitions. By 2025, it plans to collect asteroid samples near Earth, then a slew of targets by 2030. First to launch a mission to Mars to probe asteroids. Another goal, an unmanned exploration mission to Jupiter. It also plans to land Chinese astronauts on the moon for the very first time, all within the next decade. By 2035, it is aiming to develop and launch a 100-ton super heavy lift carrier rocket. And 5 years after, we could see a nuclear-powered space shuttle that will enable resource exploration and asteroid mining. There is also the intention to construct a space-based solar power station. And China aims to be a world-leading space power by 2045, one that can carry out large-scale explorations on planets and comets in the solar system and send astronauts to Mars. Now, for more, let's speak with Quentin Parker, Director of the Laboratory for Space Research at the University of Hong Kong. Mr. Parker, thanks for joining us this hour. Now, with this latest launch, what does it mean for China's space program, essentially? How much closer is it to achieving its ambitions of being a world-leading space power within the next 2 decades?
That's a very interesting question. And from my perspective, what I've been looking at over the last few years with the Chinese burgeoning space program is it's already, frankly, almost there. You know, it's the third nation state to do sample return to the moon. It brought back nearly 2 kilograms of moon rock with the Chang'e missions. It also had the first mission to the backside of the moon, and no one's ever done that before. It launched a rover to Mars successfully. Very few countries have done that successfully. And it's a big rover too, and they built an international space station. When I say international, it's not like the ISS. This one is international in the sense that all the experiments, the science missions on board the Chinese space station have gone through a UN mechanism. And so there's many countries have applied to put their experiments on the space station, and they've been approved, and they're in fact ready to go. So that's what I mean by international. And also there have been, I think, some French and German astronauts training with their taikonaut colleagues for future possible joint missions on their space station, which they're very open about. So yes, if you actually look at what's happened in the last couple of years, China's actually done an awful lot already.
Yeah, as you pointed out there, the Tiangong actually makes China only the third country in the world, apart from the US and Russia, to send up astronauts and build a space station. And we also know that Europe is set to commit billions of dollars for future space activities. Why is the space race so important to these countries?
Well, it's a whole variety of reasons. Part of it is, of course, national prestige and pride and demonstration to the world that you have the capacity to do that kind of thing. The other is straight out science, science and exploration being an activity that humankind has been pursuing for a very long time, and it's now getting more and more sophisticated, of course, as all our technologies develop. But it's also now putting down a marker about what China is intending to be in terms of a modern, science-driven, education-driven nation state of the 21st century. And if you look at the space activities around, China is right up there with America and Europe. Don't forget there are other countries like India and Japan that also have fairly strong space programs. But I think it'll be clear that in the next decade, it'll be led by China, America, and Europe.
So more countries, they are developing their own space agencies and programs. There is growing competition in this arena, of course. But given current geopolitics on the ground, the fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course, that's one of them. How has the nature of international cooperation in space shifted over time?
Well, it's a fair, as you say, we're moving from a unipolar to a multipolar geopolitical world, and that is coming whether certain quarters like it or not. It's a real politic is going on. And, you know, there are countries that would rather China wasn't quite so successful and others that wish China was even more successful. But the fact of the matter is that China, through its white paper on space exploration, has made it quite clear that it is very open to international collaboration. And this is doing this. You know, I mean, unfortunately, the International Space Station did exclude China, as you were included, because of the Wolf Amendment in the American Congress. And what that effect of that actually was to sort of crystallize the ambition of China to put vast resources into its space program because it couldn't collaborate internationally on the International Space Station. So they built their own, and a spanking new and fantastic thing it is. The Shenzhou 15 mission, for example, it docked up there yesterday, and it took about just over 8 hours to dock. You know, you're docking with the International Space Station, it takes you about 16 to 18 hours, much longer. So there's new technologies and new capabilities and capacities that are being demonstrated by the Chinese in their burgeoning space program.
So it has gone its own way, but it has also continued to emphasize peaceful collaboration with international partners in space science and governance. But there are also worries that working with China would abet its military prowess.
You know, that's an interesting question. And I'd just like to point out that, you know, there are certain countries in this world that have hundreds of military bases all over the world and a massive military industrial complex. China has been growing its military. There's no doubt about it. It's got a very powerful navy now, perhaps one of the most powerful in the world after the US. And it's developing its capacities in all sorts of ways, as it has a right to do as a nation state, as other states have done in the past over the last few hundred years. It's just the way the world goes as power shifts occur and empires crumble and fall and rise again. It's just the way that humans have been for thousands of years. And now we're approaching a new world order where it's multipolar. You know, there's the Americans, there's the Europeans, there's the Chinese and the Indians, and of course there's still Russia there because it has an extremely large nuclear arsenal.
And of course, the steady progress of the Chinese space program is worrying the Pentagon. U.S. officials have just called out China for its pursuit of space superiority. Could these developments prompt the U.S. to rethink its space initiatives?
I hope so. I mean, you know, only one country has a space force, and that's America. They put quite a few resources into it. And there's been a lot of American and military satellite missions in the past, and they will continue into the future. China's got every right, as indeed as India and any other nation state with the capacity to do the same. And so that's just what's happening, is that there's, rather than one big guy in town now, there are other new kids on the block that are flexing their muscles and trying to impress. And so in a crude way, that's what's happening. And so it's a question of how the world deals with this emerging multipolar system and how it's going to protect our planet and the security and safety of populations, and that we avoid Armageddon and cataclysm in war that none of us need. I mean, of course, what's happening in Ukraine and Russia now is very disturbing and disappointing. And I hope that a solution can be found sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and the space race continues. Mr. Parker, thank you so much for speaking with us. That was Quentin Parker, Director of the Laboratory for Space Research at the University of Hong Kong.